All right. Welcome, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the first ASHRI Emerging Fellows webinar. I'm Matt Isaac. I'm a professor of marketing at Seattle University. And I thought I would start by just introducing ASHRI. Again, we're recording the session, and so for those who are new to ASHRI, just wanted to provide some background. So ASHRI is a nonprofit organization that focuses on thought leadership in on-premise signage. So the goal is to connect academics that might be doing research in various fields, such as marketing, art, urban planning, etc., with practitioners, at signage companies, physical signage companies, be they signage manufacturers, sign designers, etc., to understand and bring new insights both to academia as well as to practitioners. So that's the goal of ASHRI. And one of the foundational programs of ASHRI is this Emerging Fellows program. So since 2017, ASHRI has been able to award fellowships and designate emerging fellows. And since 2017, we've named over 20 fellows and given out over $135,000 in awards to primarily to academics, PhD students, or assistant professors who are doing interesting work that touches on in some way on-premise signage. Let's just to share, this year we have our largest emerging fellows class ever. We have a total of 8 fellows, including 2 returning fellows, as well as 6 brand new fellows. Emerging fellows can reapply for a second year if they're interested in participating in the program for a second year. And part of the idea of this program is to provide funds for these emerging fellows, these emerging scholars, to do interesting work that might be of interest to this broader signage community. And so that was the idea that we've decided to launch this inaugural ASHRI or to launch the webinar series. And we're starting today with our inaugural webinar. And one of our returning emerging fellows, Dr. Della Clark, is going to be presenting today. Della was actually an emerging fellow last year when she was a PhD student finishing her PhD at the University of Memphis. And now she has started and is in her first year as an assistant professor of marketing at Illinois State University. And she has an interesting background where she has worked in advertising and on brand campaigns in the past prior to entering academia. Her research now focuses on understanding perceptions and decision-making in various contexts, including retail servicescape and the hiring process, as well as interactions with AI chatbots. And of course, she has work that touches on and relates to signage, which she'll be talking about today. So Della, thank you for joining us, and thanks again to everyone for being here. In terms of the format for the webinar, Della will be presenting for about 25 minutes or so. And during that time, if you have any questions, if you could just enter them into the chat and we'll try to respond and keep track of that. We will also save some time at the end for you to unmute and ask questions if you have any at that point. So again, thanks. And Della, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Isaac. Um, so yeah, kicking off the webinar series for ASHRI, and what we're going to be looking at today is diverse skin tone representation, specifically in Black-owned brands. And obviously, before I kick it off, a huge thank you to not only Dr. Isaac, but the ASHRI organization, because they have supported in multiple ways, one of them being financial. Um, so when we look at DEI and sort of this diverse skin tone representation, obviously, it's important to loop in macro political trends. Don't worry, this will not be a political commentary, but just looking at there are things that are happening. So DEI is under a lot of scrutiny. We see brands that have opted to retain their DEI programs, as well as companies that are starting to um, dismantle some of those. And when we look at DEI in consumption settings, this is something that is relatively new to the space within the last couple of decades, but we see designations such as Black-owned brands being showcased in certain retail settings. And this is a designation that consumers see when looking for brands that they may want. Obviously, there has been backlash. One of the Target brands, Honey Pot, we see a headline over here, was featured in an ad and then faced some backlash. So again, like everything, when there's change, there's good and bad. And so when we look at these overall macro shifts, obviously that's going to affect marketing. And what we've seen is that brands have recently, over the past couple of years, really honed in on inclusion. And we see this as an outcome of consumer demand where consumers are expecting brands to stand up for causes that they believe in, that brands are not just there to make money, but to provide social services in a way. And so we see, again, just this macro change of inclusive marketing being important. And when we look at how that affects advertising, obviously there's shifts in how advertising and signage is displayed. So we see, not just in skin tone representation. We see this with age, Martha Stewart being the cover girl of Sports Illustrated, something that may have seemed unfeasible a decade ago. I also have another example of just other types of skin tones, backgrounds being featured in advertising. And so when we look at skin tone representation, I want to kind of have a deeper dive into an example with Fenty Beauty. So Fenty Beauty is a brand that was created by Rihanna, and it has been in response to more representation, as we talked about, in inclusive marketing, especially with Black representation in the beauty industry. And so when we look at this representation, I think it's good to stop here and just define what DEI is. So it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's policies or practices that promote representation and inclusiveness. And it's to ensure that there's fair opportunities across the board, making sure everyone's valued, seen, and heard. And again, this is something we see it more in the news as DEI, but there have been shifts. SHRM a few years ago took out equity, so it was being referred to as I&D. So again, an evolving space. And what we saw with the launch of Fenty Beauty was that there was a huge support for beauty of all skin tones. And this is something that had been relatively undone because brands had just said it wasn't available, it was too expensive. And so we really see sort of a splash of representation, not only mattering, but the outcomes in terms of products are affected as well. And this is important because from seminal work with Elder and Krishna, when we see that look like us, we automatically have a higher affinity for that product or service. But in looking at the Black-owned brand space specifically, what I noticed was there's a variance in how skin tone is reflected. So even in a Black-owned brand space, we see a variance of skin tone, of background. And so this is something that we wanted to look at further to see if it has an effect on consumers. And concurrently, we're also seeing an uptick in AI generated images. So what we see is that more and more companies are creating social media content or even just campaigns featuring these AI models. And as you can see over on this photo on the left, there's a lot of it's starting to look more and more realistic. The customizing options are only growing. But the headlines on the right, are these AI generated models helping or hurting diversity in advertising? So we have sort of this all of these factors happening at the same time, which leads us to ask, as our world diversifies, as we have these things happening, what type of imagery is going to work best across large and diverse populations? And where we're looking is right in the sweet spot of a couple of interesting literature streams, but in a place that hasn't been looked at before. So obviously we're looking at advertising. These experiments were done with AI generated images, and we're looking at DEI because we're going to look at how different tones of skin tone could potentially affect consumer perceptions. So what I did here was we wanted to look at this with a few experimental designs. And what we did was look at different skin tones. So I've got the photo of a darker model, darker skin tone model, as well as a lighter skin tone model. Again, keeping things like most of the features the same. And what what we found was that in brand affinity, there's a preference toward the darker skin tone. And we see this also with brand perception. And when we cut this by race, we wanted to see if there's perceptions that vary by race. And what we see emerge is sort of I don't know what we would call it, kind of this Karen effect, where only in the white segment do we see a significant difference in the perceptions across these two conditions. And so what we see is that there's actually a higher preference for the darker skin tone, both in brand affinity measures and brand perception measures. And just popping back up here on these results. So this is with we looked at within a Black-owned brand space. Also, after these results, looked at positioning it not as a Black-owned brand. And we saw the same trends, but we saw it exacerbated in the Black-owned brand space. And so what we see here is that we've got this higher affinity towards darker skin tones, which may feel a little paradoxical. Um, but what we see in terms of consumer trends as a population is that overall populations are starting to have a higher affinity for darker skin tones because of macro trends of inclusivity. We're starting to see them more. And it's important to note that the only background segment that has a huge difference or a significant difference here are Caucasian customers. So we've seen this effect. This is research that is in progress, still figuring out what the underlying mechanism is here. Um, I had tried psychological distance, and that did not mediate this effect. So what we're looking at is other ways that this reframing, what is the underlying mechanism with that? And the reason that that's so important, this research is that just by having a different um, model or even just generating a different skin tone color for a model could have larger effects on consumers. And just by changing this choice decision, it's a very small, no cost included change that could have big effects. And so when we look at this overall, some of the key takeaways, again, this is research that's in progress. So I want to talk a little bit on a few limitations. Obviously, this is within a Black-owned brand specific area. It's with AI generated images. And so there are some things that I'll need to continue to do to make this more generalizable. There are also research streams on different backlash effects, different outcomes that obviously can be affected by this as well. So this is not, very clear direction. We're just examining some of the perceptions here. But what we're doing is building on multiple areas, psychology, sociology, obviously marketing, and signage, to understand how consumer biases that are even underlying um, are affecting the way that we think about brands. Another sort of anecdotal note, I had left an area for participants to leave any additional notes. And in these surveys where we see significant differences, there are a lot of comments about this, a Black-owned brand is not, that does not affect my decision making. But what we see is that the actual outcomes, it is affected. And so, where this research, helps us to further explore, there's things that we didn't look in this research, like privacy. There's a huge discussion on ethics, not only surrounding AI and AI generated images, um, but looking at how manipulating skin tone, especially in AI generated images, is that something that needs to be filtered through a more of an ethical point of view? And as we look at, opening with the amount of change in the DEI space, we have an ever evolving market that is affected by macro trends. Do we see changes in DEI creating a stronger counterculture in brands that choose to stand by DEI? It's something that consumer perceptions could even continue to evolve with those pressures. And importantly, where are some places that this research can have extensions? So, when we look at a couple of places, online grocery is a huge place. Even in-store signage, in retail and grocery settings. And so are there going to be models that hold fruit or hold certain products? If so, what will those look like? So that's a huge area that I think is fertile. Also, in looking at this is a jewelry brand on the right, the ability to control the skin tone is something that to explore whether consumers are interested in controlling that, the perceptions or downstream outcomes from that as well. So that's, I think we can open it up for questions. I think the two slides that we have here, I didn't know if you wanted to go over those, Dr. Isaac, or what we should do.
Um, yeah, I think, if there are any questions, thank you, Della. We can have those now. And then maybe at the end, we can come back and just talk about next steps for this series, as well as for those who might be interested in applying to be an emerging fellow in the next cycle.
Perfect. So yeah, again, this is research in progress, so welcome any thoughts, comments, or questions.
I will start. Della, maybe you can talk a little bit about um, the samples that you're using for your research and how that might affect the findings you've received, because I think finding is pretty counterintuitive that you are seeing such a strong positive effect for darker skin tones across the board, and you haven't quite yet been able to find boundary conditions for it. So that does seem surprising. So I wonder if that has something to do with the samples you're using, and if you think it would generalize to other samples.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So these studies were done through Cloud Research on Connect. And the limitations is that I've only done these in terms of product, only done it in a small, it was like hand creams holding a phone, a couple of different places. Um, an important item to note is that this was so paradoxical that I was concerned something was wrong, but in doing additional digging, there's been empirical evidence, and I can pull up those sites, but for overall general populations moving toward darker skin tones. So it's actually in line with what's happening on the broader scale. But yeah, these are done via Connect, an opportunity to obviously figure out boundary conditions, but multi-methods is definitely something to continue to work on that.
Great. Thank you, Della. Any other questions from the audience here?
Let's see, is there something in the chat? Several years ago, I began to work on a study that would measure responses to couples who are different races. Interesting. I don't know if you wanted to share what that led
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, at this point, I think you should be able to unmute yourself and just jump in if you have any questions or comments.
You hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Steve.
Well, we started to work on this was a long time ago. This was uh, at least 25 years ago. Um, and a couple of there were three co-authors, a couple of us got crosswise, and so the data kind of disappeared. I just wondered, I had thought about this with how couples are portrayed. One of my friends had done same-sex couples in advertising. And from that, he had made the suggestion about uh, I don't know what the politically correct ways to describe, but they were uh, couples that were different races, or at least different skin colors. How about that? I don't know. But have you thought about that direction at all?
No, that's an interesting note, and there is, obviously a huge stream on taboo. The paper that's coming to mind was a JBR a few years ago about how we have fixation on more taboo topics. The stimuli, I believe, from that paper, it had same-sex couples. It had different things that were considered taboo, even to like unsavory smells. Um, I think the other thing that your comment brings to mind is that in terms of limitations, this is just one model. So we're not looking at, I think if you have multiple models, is the skin tone representation in that model, does that interact in some way? I think you bring up
Mhm,
a good point. When you have more people, it obviously kind of changes how consumers may interpret that.
mhm. Yeah, for sure. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, actually, I'll maybe close with one last question, and then we can talk about next steps for the series. So I guess one of the big ideas of this webinar and of the Emerging Fellows Program in general is to connect insights from academia to practitioners. So what would be, I guess, your elevate get? I realize the work is in progress, and so new insights may emerge. But from what you've found so far, what would you tell someone working in the signage industry and particularly, I guess, around design, someone who's designing an in-store sign in terms of what you're finding and what they can take away from this work?
Yeah, no, great question. I think there's a couple areas where you always have to be authentic to your brand, and signage is an extension of that. But I think that part of the issue here is that it's such a polarizing topic. And I would encourage marketers to include more diversity, and maybe not from, you don't have to align with DEI, or again, it's not a political commentary, but what we're seeing is that there's a more openness, there's better perceptions when you are including different skin tone representation. So I think inclusive marketing is good for business.
Great. Thank you,
Matt,
Della.
this is Chris
Oh,
Offrey, just
yes.
one question. In terms of your sample size, I don't know, maybe you addressed this before, and not necessarily even size, it's the sample demographics. Are younger people influence or have different responses than, say, older people? Or um, I'd just be interested to hear that.
No, that's a great point. The sample that I had here, I believe we were right over 36 years in terms of average age, and it was pretty similar in replications. Um, the sample sizes, just a note on that, always had 50 per cell per Petchman 2019. But I did stratify. I didn't do it on age, which I think is, definitely something that could be interesting. Um, but yeah, when we did stratify by background, we only saw the effect change in that Caucasian group. Does that answer your
Yeah,
question?
good, thank you. My own perception is younger people tend to be less sensitive to whiteness than older people might be.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that could affect by age, and so that's a good point. Something to look at moving forward.
Yeah, I know you measured psychological distance, Della, but it might also be worth looking at something like persuasion knowledge or ad skepticism. There's an ad skepticism scale because you could also imagine that consumers might make different inferences about the marketer's motive in using, different colors, skin tones in their signs in their advertising. So that's something to think about.
No, that's a great point. Definitely something to look at.
Great. Well, why don't we, if you don't mind, going back to that last wrap-up slide where we can just talk about next steps here. Um, so yeah, so we now have on our website a schedule for the webinar series. And I think our next Emerging Fellows webinar is Lindsay May, which will be, I believe, March 19th. So if you can go to this site and you'll find the Zoom links and you can put these events on your calendar because we'd love to see you at future events. Of course, we'll be recording and sharing them as well. Also wanted to encourage you, if you know anyone who might be interested in being part of the Emerging Fellows program, so this would be a PhD student or an assistant professor that's doing work that you think might relate to signage, we will have a call for proposals that's going to be coming out this spring, either in March or in early April. And so those details will also appear on our website. And if you're not sure if your research aligns perfectly with on-premise signage or if it would be a good fit for our program, you can always reach out to me directly or to Maggie Mason, who is the executive director of ASHRI. And you should be able to find our contact information online. So with that, thanks to Della, and thanks also to Steve Kopp, who is president of ASHRI, for joining. And I think we will break. Thanks, Stella.
Thank you.